Hello and welcome back to Know Your Ship with me, Chase, and this is the third and final part of the Yorktown class of aircraft carriers, and this episode focuses primarily on the USS Enterprise. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
The extensive battle damage from 1942 call for major repairs. She will make her way to headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Then the Big E will steam for the States, where she's scheduled to undergo a massive overhaul. In May, Enterprise arrives at Pearl for the first time in more than 6 months, and she receives a very important visitor. Admiral Chester Nimitz steps aboard Enterprise. He stands on hollowed ground, a ship that has come to represent the war itself. A floating battlefield. The wooden deck has been the scene of countless acts of heroism and horror. Nimitz is met by nearly 2,000 sailors, airmen, and Marines, who stand at rigid attention. As the crew looks on, he presents Captain Samuel Ginder with the Presidential Unit Citation.
The highest honor that could be given to a ship in the American Navy is the Presidential Unit Citation.
Enterprise is the first American ship ever to receive this award. Not even famous 19th century sailing frigate USS Constitution can claim such an honor.
It's such a big deal because, of course, it is something that is proposed and sponsored by the President of the United States. When the President himself determines that a particular unit or a particular ship is worthy of commendation for a particular action, it is the head man taking time to acknowledge the good work of a particular group of men. It is probably the greatest morale-building moment that the men on the ship see in the early part of the war.
When we were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, Admiral Bull Halsey sent a message to the Enterprise there, something to the effect, "My heart is always with you." And I think that did as much for us as the award of that citation, because we all thought so much of Bull Halsey and his leadership.
With her battle honors posted on the hangar deck for her entire crew to see, Enterprise finally heads for the good old USA. Bremerton, Washington, summer 1943. The Big E slips into Puget Sound. It's the first time the mighty carrier has been stateside in years. Now, the decorated ship is in for a massive overhaul to make her even tougher and more deadly.
In summer 1943, the Enterprise went through a repair overhaul. Now, she had been through significant combat and suffered a lot of damage. They looked at this and drew lessons learned from it.
Hundreds of yard workers swarm in to trick out the mighty flat top and get her ripped and ready for more combat. Her additions: a protective torpedo blister, more guns, new radar, and a new plane that will literally change the face of war. The Navy realizes that the greatest threat to carriers like Enterprise are enemy air attacks and Japanese torpedoes.
They proceed to install a torpedo blister along 3/4 of her length that will give her better protection against any torpedo hits that she suffers.
Japanese torpedoes killed her sisters Yorktown and Hornet. The Navy is bound to ensure that Enterprise does not suffer the same fate. The torpedo blister is a steel belt that wraps around the outer edge of the Big E's hull. Between the huge bulge and the ship itself is a part flooded, part air-filled compartment that will absorb the shock of explosion and the sharp fragments of a Japanese warhead. 18 more feet of solid steel and timber are added to her overall length, and her damage control equipment and radar is replaced. But the most important improvement: new 5-inch guns and 36 additional 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns.
The guns were the main thing. We had more quad 40s, and I can't remember now how many there were. Those were big cannons, and they were, when they go off, they make a lot of racket. We had better armament.
Brand new fire control systems link her 5-inch and 40mm batteries. Defending the carrier isn't easy. Enterprise's firepower must pepper the skies with a barrage of flak to hit Imperial planes. But in order to kill the enemy, accurate shooting is a must. radar-controlled directors can pinpoint the distance and elevation of incoming aircraft and help ensure a kill. Mark 37 and Mark 51 gun directors are mounted on either side of the Big E's island. These systems will provide vital target data and will guide the fire of Enterprise's heavy weapons. The directors calculate firing orders for the gunners' mates, giving the crews the accurate elevation, range, and velocity of an enemy target. And the radar can detect incoming Japanese aircraft at 45,000 yards. And enemy vessels at 40,000 yards. The Big E will now be able to shred any incoming enemy planes that invade her airspace, day or night. Nothing in the Japanese anti-aircraft arsenal can compare to the firepower of the radar-guided 40mm guns and 5-inch rifles.
By the end of World War II, no one else's anti-aircraft defenses come anywhere close to the Americans. American warships are incredibly dangerous to approach by the end of 1943, and that situation only gets grimmer for any Japanese attacker as 1944 and 45 goes on.
It's the new F-6F HELLCAT fighter. Since Pearl Harbor, American pilots have struggled against the infamous speed of the Japanese Zero. The enemy fighter plane has ruled the skies of the Pacific for nearly 2 years, outrunning and outgunning the Wildcat. Not anymore. Now, the U.S. introduces a weapon that will change the face of warfare for the entire fleet.
The arrival of the F-6F HELLCAT is a real watershed in terms of the American capabilities to both bring offensive firepower to the Japanese and also to defend the fleet effectively.
During the refit, Enterprise took on a squadron of the new fighter planes. 33 feet long, with a maximum speed of 376 miles per hour to the Wildcat's 320 miles per hour. The F-6F is faster and 5 feet longer than the Wildcat. She's also got more firepower. With a standard armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns, she can deliver 2,400 rounds of fearsome ordnance on the enemy and can launch bombs or unguided rockets. The U.S. Navy finally has a fighter plane that is more than a match for the legendary Zero.
It's a deadly aircraft when you consider the complement of 50-caliber machine guns on it. It's also rugged and reliable. It's going to change the course of the Pacific War.
In command of the new squadron is Butch O'Hare, one of the best fighter jocks in the U.S. Navy. With 3 years of flying and a score of enemy planes under his belt, Missouri native Edward O'Hare has already earned a Medal of Honor by destroying 5 twin-engine bombers in a single day, becoming the first naval ace in World War II.
Everybody had just the deepest respect for Butch O'Hare because he was fearless. He was a natural-born leader. He was a hero. There's no other way around it.
November 25th, 1943, 7 p.m. It's Thanksgiving Day, 5 days after launching the assault on Macon. But in the waters off of Macon Atoll, there's no time for prayer. Flares explode in the skies over USS Enterprise and her task group. Moments later, Japanese twin-engine bombers streak overhead, delivering a grim message with Imperial warheads. Battleship North Carolina and the destroyer escorts open fire and beat down the enemy. But Enterprise holds her fire. Nearly 2 years of combat in the Pacific War have taught the crew that tracers fired from her anti-aircraft guns only mark the ship as a target in the shadows of night. Instead, she leaves the job to the gunships around her. The air above the task force explodes with shells from the escorts. For Lieutenant Harte and his untested Marines, this is the first brush with the enemy. The Leathernecks man their battle stations and await the order to fire.
I'd never seen a war before, and I wanted to get a good look at it, so I climbed up on an ammunition box so I could see better. And there was a much wiser sergeant sitting beside me and standing beside me, and he said, "Lieutenant, I think you better get down. That's not a good place to stand." So fortunately, I jumped down, and I think the split second after my feet hit the deck, there was a whang.
A piece of shrapnel the size of Harte's hand slams into the splinter shield right where he'd been standing only seconds before. It could have cut the Marine in two.
So that taught me that there's no sense sticking my head up when I didn't have to.
Gunners aboard Enterprise hold their fire as the battle rages on. If they open up with their guns, they might suffer the same fate as USS Chicago.
We stood there by our guns, helpless and not doing anything, but we were well protected by battleships and cruisers, and of course the destroyers on the periphery of the task force. And then of course the Japs would have aerial flares that light up like your stadium in a football game.
The fire from 40mm and 5-inch shells would make Enterprise a prime target.
And when you've got many guns going, it is like a Christmas tree. Everything is lighted up, and it marks your position. If you don't have any lights showing, but a gun shoots for 20 seconds or something like that, an enemy, he'd have a position on you.
Battleship North Carolina hammers out a lethal explosion of lead and blasts a Betty out of the sky. Within minutes, the assault is over. The Japanese have failed to sink a single American ship. Enterprise is safe. She survives to see another sunset in the tropics. The next morning, American commanders decide that something must be done to protect Enterprise when darkness falls. For years, the Japanese Navy and Army have utilized extensive night training and tactics, and they know that the U.S. fleet has not practiced this type of warfare. Almost 2 years into World War II, nightfall is still one of the greatest threats. If the U.S. Navy is going to save its carriers at night, it's going to have to adapt to the type of night attack strategy that the Japanese use against them.
We had on board at the time an air group commander named Bill Martin, and he'd been interested in night flying. And he couldn't get it off his mind, and he finally prevailed on the powers that be to do a little bit of experimenting.
For the first time in the Pacific War, a night air operation will be launched from an American carrier. And Medal of Honor ace Butch O'Hare answers the call to lead a group of volunteers on this experimental mission.
Somebody like Butch O'Hare that volunteers to launch off a carrier, first of all, at night for the very first time, what does that say about him? That just shows you that he is a true professional. And I guarantee it, he's the kind of guy that volunteered to do it so his buddies wouldn't have to.
O'Hare's volunteers are nicknamed the Black Panthers. The radar in the Avenger will make the entire operation possible. It will literally be the eyes in the sky. Without it, O'Hare and his fellow fighter pilots would be flying blind. Designed by MIT engineers, the heavy radar set in the TBF will locate the enemy planes and guide O'Hare's fighters into shooting position. Flying in the radar-equipped Avenger is ALVIN KERNAN.
And we were supposed to go up, and between the radar on board the ship and the radar in the torpedo plane, we were supposed to find these intruders, Japanese raiders, and lead the fighter planes to them. I wasn't afraid, I remember that. I always felt that your fear came while you were on the deck. And then when you got in the plane and pulled up the armor plate and locked yourself in, there wasn't any way of getting out. So the fear seemed to go away.
As the coming night approaches, the Enterprise airmen prepare for their mission impossible.
I watched Butch as he went to his plane that evening of the 26th, and he looked like he had the world on his shoulders.
At 6 p.m., the three planes take off in search of enemy aircraft. 7 p.m. Sure enough, the Black Panthers run right into a force of incoming twin-engine Bettys, headed for Enterprise and the American task force. Kernan and his comrades can clearly make out nearly 20 Japanese bombers, flying in different formations, all of them headed for Enterprise and the task force. TBF closes within 200 yards of Abeti and opens fire.
It wasn't until they started firing right back at me that I began to get a little frightened.
The two warplanes hammer away at each other. Hot lead from the Avenger's 50s burn the enemy bomber. 3 miles away, O'Hare and his wingman can see the tracers of the Avenger and watch as the flaming enemy plane pitches towards the ocean. The fighters race to catch up with the TBF. Just then, the Avenger nails yet another Japanese Betty. Somehow, a Betty maneuvers just behind and above O'Hare's fighter plane. The enemy plane tears into O'Hare's HELLCAT with 7.7mm bullets. The famous aviator is caught in a deadly stream of lead. Suddenly, O'Hare's plane rolls away and disappears into the darkness. He's never seen again. The Japanese night attack is halted, but the loss of O'Hare devastates the crew of Enterprise. One of Enterprise's and America's finest warriors is gone. Neither his aircraft nor his remains are ever recovered.
It really hurt us when he went down. I think it was the sadness was felt throughout the whole ship that we'd really lost a hero when Butch was lost.
America's first night combat mission has cost one of its top aces. And the future of this new strategy is uncertain. But despite the tragic fate of Butch O'Hare, Enterprise has successfully launched the first night air interception. Once again, the Big E has just made history. Guided onto the Big E's flight deck, the surviving Black Panthers amazingly make it aboard at 9 p.m.
It's a big moment because previously, fighter aircraft flying combat air patrol for the aircraft carrier were operating almost exclusively during the day. But now, as of November 26, 1943, they can do it at night.
As November draws to a close, the Gilbert Islands are now firmly in the hands of U.S. forces. Unlike the months-long campaign for Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy now has the power to deliver a faster killing blow. What begins at Macon and Tarawa will continue until the enemy is brought to its knees. For the mighty Enterprise, the Gray Ghost, it is only the beginning of a long campaign. Amazingly, the submarine spots Admiral Ozawa's forces. One by one, the dark shapes of 6 aircraft carriers appear on the horizon. Immediately, the sub reports the sighting. Admiral Mark Mitcher now knows that Ozawa and his carriers are on the way. Thanks to the lone submarine, Enterprise and the U.S. fleet know that an all-out carrier battle is coming. The U.S. command is now dead certain that Ozawa is on his way to Saipan, so they order Mitcher to divide his forces. While the older battleships like USS Tennessee and Pennsylvania remain at Saipan with the escort carriers, Mitcher leads the 8 fleet carriers, including Enterprise, and 7 light carriers west to the island of Tinian, where they will intercept Ozawa's forces. The new fast battleships and the cruisers form a battle line well ahead of the carriers. They will provide an anti-aircraft barrier and will finish off any enemy vessels crippled in battle. Ozawa's forces head northeast from the Philippines in 2 elements. The first line of warships are light carriers, cruisers, and the super battleships Musashi and Yamato under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita. 100 miles to the rear are carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho, with 3 additional light carriers. June 20th, 1944. The Imperial Navy has been sent to halt an American offensive at Saipan. The U.S. fleet has been putting up a vicious fight, blasting hundreds of enemy planes out of the sky. Yet, Enterprise and her carrier comrades have been unable to locate the main enemy fleet. Now, the skies over the Philippine Sea are filled with American airplanes on the hunt for Admiral Ozawa. seek and destroy mission goes on for hours. And still, Admiral Mark Mitcher cannot find Admiral Ozawa. Tension is high aboard the Big E as the afternoon wears on. But at 3:40 p.m., they hit pay dirt. 300 miles away, Enterprise search planes finally discover the enemy fleet. Among the Enterprise sailors in the sky is Tom Watts of Torpedo Squadron 10.
I was in one of the search planes and found them that next day.
Now, Mark Mitcher paces the deck of Carrier Lexington, knowing that the next few hours could change the course of the entire campaign. It will be 4 p.m. before he can refuel his bombers and get them airborne. If they launch late in the day, the air groups will have to fly for 2 hours before they reach the enemy. And even if they survive the battle, they will have to find their way back to the carriers in the dark. Sending the attack now could be a death sentence for hundreds of American pilots. A disaster for the entire Navy. But as each minute passes, Mitcher realizes that complete victory slips further away. Finally, he gives a simple order. Launch them. Within minutes, in the ready rooms of Enterprise and every flat top in the fleet, Mitcher's final orders are chalked on the blackboards. Get the carriers. 4:30 p.m. 240 Hellcats, Avenger torpedo planes, and dive bombers roar through the skies over the wine-dark Philippine Sea. They head right into the late afternoon sun, on the prowl for Admiral Ozawa. Killer Kane leads the Enterprise strike. 11 dive bombers, 5 Avengers, and 12 F-6F Hellcat fighters. Among the pilots are Flash Gordon and James Jigdog Ramage. Every pilot knows the factors of speed, distance, time, and fuel. Flash Gordon is thankful he's in a Hellcat with a belly tank.
We had a lot of fuel in the Hellcat, because we had umpteen fuel if you just knew how to conserve.
But leading the older, slower SBDs, Jigdog Ramage is less optimistic. He warns his rear seat gunner, Dave Cawley.
So I called Cawley and said, looks like we're going to have a bath tonight, so get everything ready.
The Enterprise flyers head into a blood-red sun, uncertain of combat, dead certain that the next few hours could spell disaster. 6:30 p.m. Finally, after 2 hours in the air, Killer Kane's air group spots the enemy fleet. 12,000 feet below, they've discovered a major part of Ozawa's force. 3 carriers, Ryuho, Junyo, and Hiyo. Kane's forces immediately split up and make a run for the enemy vessels. The Japanese surface ships open up with a deadly fusillade of flak as the dive bombers and Hellcats begin their assault. But they keep right on coming. Jigdog Ramage and 5 SBDs line up for a bombing run on the carrier Ryuho. Jigdog wings over and makes a steep dive on the enemy ship.
I put the pipper, as we called it, just forward of the bow and went down to the 2,000 feet, maybe a little lower, dropped my bomb.
Ramage delivers 1,000 pounds of tear on the Ryuho and immediately pulls out of his dive. It's a crippling near miss. One by one, 4 other SBDs drop their payloads over the Imperial flat top. From his rear seat position, Cawley gets a choice opportunity to admire the grisly work of his comrades. Ryuho has been mauled, and carrier Hiyo is wounded by torpedoes and is burning. Enterprise bomb hits help finish her off. Just as the Hellcats rejoin the dive bombers, Flash Gordon spots a target of opportunity.
We're down on the water, maybe 10 miles east. I saw a Zero headed west, about 900 feet.
Gordon immediately firewalls the Hellcat and pulls the big plane into a half loop and a half roll. He races after the Zero, draws a bead and cuts loose with his rapid-fire 50s.
pulled up in the top of a loop and shot him down. He blew up. Then we came back down and joined up with the bombers.
The Zero is Flash Gordon's 7th and final kill of World War II. He and his fellow pilots escape the last enemy flak bursts and head for home. But though the battle with the Japanese task force might be over, the struggle to survive the flight back to Enterprise has just begun. As the last rays of light disappear over the horizon, the Enterprise pilots and air crews continue their long trek home. Ramage and his fellow dive bombers will have to carefully conserve their fuel supply.
It was very quiet. About halfway back then, I told Conley, I think we're going to make it.
But for some American pilots, their luck has run out. Many are battle damaged, and the heavy Avengers are already running out of gas. There's no telling if any of the flyers will ever see Enterprise or the American fleet again. In the confusion, groups of planes scatter, heading off in different directions into the unknown. The situation seems hopeless. Over the radio, Enterprise pilots can hear the painful distress calls of their fellow airmen, followed by the sickening sound of aircraft hitting the water. Patches of green phosphorescence, the dye markers for aviators in distress, dot the blackness of the Pacific, marking the spot where the journey has ended for some Navy pilots. The painful odyssey goes on for 2 hours. It's absolute desolation, a dark sea that stretches endlessly in every direction. But then, just as all hope seems lost, Grim Reaper Flash Gordon sees the impossible. The destroyer escorts of the U.S. fleet. One by one, the little gunships turn on their bright searchlights, marking the way back for their fellow sailors in the sky.
And then some destroyers had been sent out to meet us, and their searchlights were up, and
Home is that way. I'll never forget.
Back on Enterprise, her sailors and Marines can only wait and watch the dark skies for their warplanes and pilots.
Our pilots had limited fuel left, and of course everybody was pulling for the guys to make it home.
At 8:45 p.m. The first warplanes arrive over the American task force. It's simply chaos. Most are flying on fumes, and even worse, distant lightning has confused some pilots, and now they're headed off in the wrong direction. Mitcher could have a catastrophe on his hands. So, ignoring standard naval procedures, he utters one of the most famous commands in the Pacific War: turn on the lights. The entire fleet illuminates in a shower of search beams and running lights aboard the carrier decks. Even escort vessels fire off star shells to light up the skies. But the guiding lights are a mixed blessing for many of the pilots.
Sounds real good to light up all the ships, but it was very difficult because you couldn't tell the carriers from the destroyers and cruisers and so forth.
Night carrier operations are a new strategy, and most of the young pilots have never made a landing in the dark. Many of them make rough water landings. The air is filled with crunching sounds of steel and salt water.
there was a fiasco down there. No one was getting aboard, and some did. They had an accident.
From their battle stations along the flight deck, the Big E's Marines have a dangerous front row seat.
Two of them would try to land at the same time, and they'd go respective ways. One go clockwise and one go counterclockwise.
Within minutes, Enterprise's flight deck looks like a parking lot. Jig Dog Ramage and his fellow bomber pilots scatter across the fleet, landing on any friendly deck they can find. In the skies overhead, Flash Gordon and his fellow Reapers orbit over the task force, searching for a place to land. But now, they're also running on fumes.
A little after 10, my number 4 man said his red light was on. So we got down the landing pattern, and when I came around, the deck was foul. I landed aboard the Lexington. Well, it was 10:20. It had been in the air 6 hours.
10:20 p.m. The last of 23 planes that make it aboard Enterprise touches down on her flight deck. Most of them are from other carriers. In the confusion, the air groups have been completely jumbled up. But, miraculously, the Big E only has one pilot missing in the desperate night carrier landings. Killer Kane. Everyone else has either made it aboard a friendly ship or has been rescued. The last-ditch assault on the Japanese task force and the frantic night recovery has cost the U.S. fleet 99 warplanes. But thankfully, the human toll is much less. Only 49 pilots and air crewmen and 6 flight deck sailors have been lost in the chaotic battle. For the next 2 days, destroyer escorts crisscross the sea searching for Killer Kane. For some of these ships, the reward for a salvage flyer is an extra ration of ice cream for the crew. On the afternoon of the 22nd, a destroyer approaches the Enterprise, flashing its signal lights. Suddenly, the hearts of everyone aboard are lifted. The question from the destroyer: how much ice cream is Killer Kane worth?
Since he was a commander, they wanted 25 gallons of ice cream for commander, group commander. They wanted extra rations of ice cream. And they got it.
A few tubs of ice cream are a small price to pay for the veteran aviator. As the glow of sunlight gradually brightens the horizon, 500 miles north of Surigao Strait, USS Enterprise and the 3rd Fleet prepare for a battle of their own. The decoy of empty Japanese carriers has reached the waters off Cape Engano, the northeast tip of the main Philippine island of Luzon. Ironically, the meaning of the Spanish word Engano is deceit or delusion. October 25th, 6 a.m. Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet launches scout planes to search for the enemy's aircraft carriers. Other bombers and fighters also take to the air to be ready to attack at a moment's notice. At 7:15 a.m., just over an hour after launch, the scouts report contact. They've spotted the enemy's northern force. At the heart of this fleet are 4 aircraft carriers, 1 full-size flat-top, and 3 light carriers.
They had just a few planes on them, but they were supposed to be the cheese in the trap.
Escorting the carriers are 2 aging battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The vessel of most interest to Admiral Halsey is the full-size flat-top. It's the Zuikaku, the sole remaining carrier from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force.
Zuikaku and her sister ship Shokaku were the 2 carriers that he most wanted to sink. Shokaku, of course, had been destroyed at Philippine Sea.
The 3rd Fleet bombers waste no time commencing the attack. Wave after wave of American fighters and bombers pour lead and explosives into the Japanese carrier force. Zuikaku comes under attack by bombers from USS Lexington, Essex, and Langley. They drill 7 torpedoes into the hull of the big carrier and plant 9 bombs on her deck. At the same time, 3 miles away and 10,000 feet above the fight, dive bombers from USS Enterprise turn their attention to the light carrier Zuiho.
The dive bombers and the torpedo bombers pressed so hard and so close to Zuiho that it was hard for them to even miss their targets. So they dropped their torpedoes and their bombs. They stopped the Zuiho dead in its tracks, and it was on fire.
But close by, the guns of battleship Issei are still blasting out murderous fire. Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese light carrier Zuiho is battered, in flames, and no longer a threat in the battle off Cape Engano. With Zuiho dead in the water, an Avenger torpedo bomber from Enterprise is quickly diverted to another target, the battleship Issei. The Avenger, redirected toward Issei, is piloted by Ensign Mike Krause. And down below, in the well of the plane, is Radioman Bombardier Arthur KROPP. The Avenger buzzes toward the battleship through a tremendous volume of anti-aircraft fire. Multicolored flak explodes all around the American bomber. Despite the danger, Mike Krause keeps his eye on the battleship, and Arthur KROPP keeps his nose in the radar scope, calling the range to the target. But one of the explosions is a little too close for comfort.
We took a hit under our tail. The window right by my head broke out, and Mikey recovered, and I thought, well, I got hit for sure. I felt something trickling down the back of my neck. I said, uh-oh.
Still, the determined crew keeps their focus on the mission.
I kept calling the range for him, so we went on down, made our run, and I watched our torpedo hit good.
As the Avenger pulls away, Arthur KROPP gets a chance to check his wound.
As it turned out, all it was is some bilge water that trickled down, so I was okay. Didn't get hit. It must have been a big shell went under us, whatever it was. And a piece of shrapnel probably busted out the window. That's all I can say.
The Avenger's route out of the battle area takes it over the sinking aircraft carrier Zuikaku. The carrier's deck is filled with Japanese sailors.
Mike slowed down, almost stall speed, went right over the top of that carrier. And the Japanese were shaking their swords at us and their fists and that. And for whatever reason, I don't know, I just gave them the finger as I went by.
The Zuikaku has been responsible for the deaths of many Americans, and U.S. bomber crews in the battle off Cape Engano are ecstatic to finally see it listing, minutes away from disappearing beneath the waves.
The original Pearl Harbor strike force has now been utterly destroyed, and Pearl Harbor has been avenged.
March 18th, 5:17 a.m. Enterprise floats near Iwo Jima as the first flights return from their night bombing raids. Enterprise radar spots a formation of aircraft 75 miles away and closing fast. But they can't tell if the planes are friend or foe. At 7:30 a.m., the men of Enterprise see the formation themselves. It looks like an American squadron. A single plane breaks away from the group 500 feet above sea level and begins a shallow glide toward Enterprise.
We watched it coming, and she looked just like a TVF. Nobody fired at it. All we could see was the front, and she kept coming and coming and coming.
But at 200 feet away, the horrifying truth hits.
And suddenly we realized this wasn't a friendly airplane, and he literally was flying just a few feet above our flight deck.
It's a Judy dive bomber. The Big E's 20mm guns rattle out their response. But it is too late. Only a few feet above the flight deck, the Judy opens her belly door and drops a 550-pound bomb.
I thought, oh God, that's the end of us. I got blown up in the air and came down on my rear end. And I heard this voice saying, "Sir, can we abandon the battery? The bomb is down here." And there was this big, ugly bomb right beside one of our batteries.
The bomb miraculously has crashed through the flight deck, bounces back up and skitters across the deck without going off.
All these Marines with their white faces, big, big eyes, staring at it.
All eyes are on the terrifying object. until young sailor Pedro Sandoval can't stand it any longer.
I look around, trying to see which way to get rid of it. So some of my friends helped me roll the bomb all the way to the fantail and drop it off the flight deck into the water. We didn't know nothing about whether the bomb was armed or not. We just went out there to get rid of it.
It is a direct hit at point-blank range, and it turns out to be a dud. Lucky Enterprise, once again, earns her nickname. March 20th, Enterprise returns to her base of operations off Okinawa. They expect an attack from the same flyers who hit Franklin. They are not disappointed. The initial wave of Japanese dive bombers appears at 4 p.m. The first assault comes from a diving Judy. 2,000 feet above Enterprise, the bomber drops its 500-pound payload. The bomb travels the entire length of the Big E's deck before it hits the sea less than 50 feet from the starboard bow. It explodes in the ocean, sending jets of water over the flight deck. At 4:24, another Judy begins its dive. The ship's guns open up, taking her out just 500 feet away. But the Big E's fabled luck may be starting to run out. As the Judy dives, Enterprise is hit by 2 5-inch exploding shells from one of her own ships.
We got a lot of damage from our own anti-aircraft fire, and you can't really help that. It's the ship in line on the other side. Why, that's tough luck.
The American shells hit the Big E's 40mm gun tub, killing 7 men and wounding 30. The explosion sets fire to a nearby HELLCAT. Its ammo ignites. At the same moment, another Judy dives, heading straight toward the deck. At 500 feet, she drops her package. The bomb explodes on the port deck. Enterprise is on fire.
The whole island structure had flames going through it, and our platform that we worked off of was just like a griddle with a fire underneath it.
Damage control leaps into action, spraying fire foam across the flaming deck. Enterprise carries a damage control crew of 300, spread out in small groups throughout the ship. The Big E's damage control chief, John Monroe, had been wise enough to secretly requisition several times its quota of fire foam while back in Pearl. Now it's paying off. Within 30 minutes, the fires raging on deck are under control. 15 minutes after that, all fires are out. Enterprise guns continue to hammer at the sky. They shoot down the last bomber at 5:10 p.m. The skies are clear once again. With the flames smothered, it's clear that the bomb damage is surprisingly minor. And Enterprise is left with a strange souvenir of the attack. The fuselage of a Japanese dive bomber is lodged in the hull of the ship.
We look down, and the engine is stuck in the side of the ship, and of course the wave action of our ship going 20, 25 knots, that plane torn up a little bit more all the time.
The Enterprise has been hit, but she is still going strong. Her luck has held so far. As Enterprise heads for the Navy repair base at Ulithi Atoll, the Japanese are now creating a far more deadly fighting force. One that yearns only for death. Called Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. They are a potent threat. The first suicide attacks back in 1942 may have been ad hoc decisions by wounded fighter pilots. But by late 1944, they have become Japanese policy. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi is the mastermind of the kamikaze squadrons. Onishi realizes that his poorly trained, under-equipped Air Corps may have one final force multiplier: suicide strikes. Now, in April, Allied intelligence reports that Onishi has assembled an entire force of 400 aircraft of every type and age, each packed with as much explosives as possible. It is Japan's final defense of its homeland.
sometimes the kamikazes are portrayed as desperate, as fanatical. And I don't necessarily think that they should be construed in such a way. Of course, yes, the Japanese were at that point in a desperate situation, but it has to be construed as the Japanese using a serious weapon, a serious and deadly weapon.
To the crewmen of Enterprise, the kamikaze are confusing, inexplicable, terrifying.
It made your skin kind of crawl. You didn't know what was going on in their minds. You didn't know if they were going to do that again. It changed the whole complexion of the war.
You can't rationalize. We're not coming from the same place. It doesn't make any sense.
It's pretty scary.
The Japanese are willing to sacrifice their best, and the tactics are working. In March, America launches an assault on the islands closest to Japan. It is the final act of the long Pacific War. And like any great stage drama, the last act is the most spectacular and the deadliest. April 11th, 1945, at 1:30 p.m., the first of the dreaded kamikaze force makes its long-awaited appearance. Radar reports incoming bogies 80 miles out. Enterprise begins her standard evasive pattern, its outlying ships tightening their protective circle. Speed increased to 25 knots, all eyes on the horizon. At 2:05, the first Zero dives out of the sky, aiming for the nearby carrier Essex. Suddenly, it changes its target and plummets straight toward the Big E.
They're diving at a pretty fast rate of speed. They always look like they're heading right for the bridge of your nose.
All guns open fire. The day's first kamikaze smashes into the sea only 500 yards to starboard. But seconds later, a kamikaze dive bomber drops out of the sky, dead astern. It is the worst possible position for the Enterprise, preventing her side guns from taking aim. Enterprise swings around to provide firepower. Sailors manning her port 40 millimeters open up. The kamikaze keeps coming as the 40s keep up their onslaught. It is a deadly duel to the finish.
I can honestly say what must have been going through his head as a kamikaze pilot's coming at him, shooting at him at the same time, and he knows that he's got to take that bird out of the air before it gets to his ship. You got to stand your ground. You can focus on the task at hand to take him out, to protect you and your buddies.
The duel ends when the bomber hits the hull at full speed. The kamikaze attack ruptures 8 fuel tanks and floods the torpedo blister. Surprisingly, there are no casualties. And as damage control gets to work, the attacks continue. At 3 p.m., another dive bomber is shot down only 25 feet off the bow. But as she hits the water, her bomb goes off, sending flaming fragments onto the deck of Enterprise. A HELLCAT still in the catapult bursts into flames. Damage control moves quickly and catapults the flaming fighter into the sea. Another kamikaze begins its run and is shot down. Then another. And another. By nightfall, 6 kamikaze assaults have been foiled. Enterprise has been hit. 5 men have been wounded. But the ship's famous luck has held. It is 5:30 a.m., May 14th. For the round-the-clock warriors of the Big E, the day is just beginning.
We'd come back in about 5:30 and about 6 o'clock or so, we'd crawl in our bunks and we'd get some sleep. And here comes the kamikazes. The 5-inch will open up, and that'd wake us up. So then we'd sit up in our bunks. Everything was quiet. Then we'd crawl back in our bunk, try to go back to sleep.
At 6:10 a.m., a new set of bogies are detected by radar. 12 groups, several miles out. The Enterprise crew members prepare for another kamikaze assault. Within minutes, the first suicide plane begins its run, headed directly for the center of the Big E's deck. Enterprise's guns open up. To the crew's surprise, the kamikaze takes no defensive action and is quickly shot down. The kamikaze pilots are barely trained, raw recruits, easy prey for Enterprise's seasoned gunners. Within a half hour, 5 kamikazes are shot from the sky. But at 6:50 a.m., a single Zero begins to tail the Big E, staying out of range, darting in and out of the fat white cumulus clouds. At 6:56, as Enterprise swings around in evasive action, the Zero sees its opportunity. From dead astern, the Japanese fighter begins its dive. Enterprise keeps turning, bringing her guns into play.
We whirled around one of the fighters, single plane. Boy, everybody unloaded on him.
The Zero is taking lots of lead, wobbling in its advance, yet still it comes. Now the 20s are firing directly across Enterprise's decks, and it looks like the ship's luck will hold.
He flew down our port side, up about 200 feet, I'd say. And I thought, you know, he's going to overshoot. Thank God he missed us.
Then, to the shock of all on board, the Zero rolls left, turns upside down, and perfectly, elegantly dives straight down into the ship's #1 elevator. The largest explosion in the ship's storied history shakes her from bow to stern. 5 decks below, the Zero's 500-pound bomb goes off with such power that the entire flight elevator flies straight up into the air. A photograph taken from the nearby USS Washington captures the astonishing moment, where the explosive power of a single kamikaze rockets a 15-ton elevator over 400 feet straight up.
Started to get up. All this stuff started coming back down, pieces of flight deck and beams, and I don't know what all had been blown up in the air. It seemed like forever that it was coming down on top of us.
Like a knife to the heart, Enterprise has been hit as never before. Fire fills the elevator shaft and hangars. The flight deck is blasted and buckled. The forward guns are gone. The gasoline system is destroyed. Men are blown overboard, and 2,000 tons of water begins to pour in through the wounded ship's hull. The mighty Enterprise lists 7 feet, a sitting duck for the next kamikazes. Damage control goes into high gear with practiced expertise from 1,000 drills, putting out fires, rescuing wounded men, trying to save the ship. The surviving gunners look to the sky to fend off the next attacks. 13 men are killed, 68 wounded, and 8 are thrown overboard.
When the dust settles, so to speak, and you call off the numbers, and Walter Kyle's missing.
19-year-old Marine Walter Kyle has manned a gun on Enterprise for over a year. There is no sign of him amid the destruction.
And his gun was pretty much closest to the explosion. Barrel was bent, and so on. We figured he must have gone over the side.
Kyle has survived the explosion by jumping overboard.
When I hit the water, and then when I got up, I started swimming a short distance, I saw this huge wreckage, and I went toward it.
Kyle climbs to safety on the floating remains of the ruined flight deck elevator. He finds 2 other soaked sailors. He is eventually rescued by a destroyer and returned to the Big E. When Kyle returns, he finds the once mighty carrier is now a smoking wreck. Damage control has done its best, but there is a gaping hole where the elevator once stood. The ship lists with holes blasted in the hull. Fires have damaged her planes. As the wounded giant limps off the battlefield, the repair crews assess the damage. It is not good news. With a missing flight elevator and a buckled deck, launching and landing planes is impossible. She's an aircraft carrier who can't launch aircraft. In nearly 4 years of war, the Big E has survived multiple attacks from air, sea, and beneath the waves. It took just one pilot with suicidal intent and brilliant flying skills to do what the rest of the Japanese Navy could never do: take Enterprise out of the war. In October 1945, the Big E is back in the water, powering into New York Harbor for a national celebration for the victorious U.S. Navy, with Enterprise as the guest of honor.
Yeah, that was a great celebration. She welcomed over 200,000 visitors to the ship for a week. And then they had the big parade down Avenue of the Americas. And the Enterprise Navy Band was selected to lead that parade.
Thousands of curious onlookers come aboard the legendary ship, there to read her posted scorecard. 20 service stars, one for every major battle. 911 aircraft destroyed, 71 ships sunk. The most successful and the most decorated ship up to that point in the history of the U.S. Navy. In May 1946, a year after the war is over, Enterprise is back in dry dock and in limbo. The U.S. Navy looks to the future, and the future is jets. In fact, some of the first experimental jet fighters flew combat missions in World War II. Yet the Big E's decks and structure are not large enough or strong enough to support jet warfare. She is an honored warrior whose wars are behind her. The question remains, what to do with her? The U.S. Secretary of the Navy suggests that Enterprise become a floating museum, calling her the one vessel that best symbolizes the Navy in the war. Admiral Bull Halsey leads an effort to raise money for an Enterprise museum, but it is not to be. The Big E, greatest warrior of the Pacific, is finally sold for scrap.
They couldn't save it, to sold for scrap. That hurt. I cried.
Underway for the last time, the USS Enterprise moves from Brooklyn Navy Yard to Kearney, New Jersey, and the wreckers. Thus is marked the failure of Admiral Bull Halsey's campaign to have the Big E preserved as a national shrine. Obsolete in the jet and atomic age, the one vessel that most nearly symbolized the role of the Navy in the Pacific War heads meekly for the scrap heap.